The document was sitting right there on his desk. I wasn't supposed to be in his office that afternoon. He thought I was at my mother's old house, 2 hours away, dealing with the last few boxes she had left behind. He thought he had until Sunday night before I'd come home. He thought he had time. He was wrong about that. I picked up the paper, I read the first line, and then I read it again. Because sometimes your brain refuses to process something the first time. It just rejects it, like a body rejecting a transplant. It pushes the information away because accepting it would require changing everything you believe about your life. It was a transfer of ownership document. Our business, the one my mother had spent 20 years building from absolutely nothing. The one she had put in my name before she passed. The one I had poured 11 years of my life into, side by side with the man I thought I knew better than anyone on earth. He was signing it over, all of it. The property, the operating accounts, the client contracts, the name, everything that had ever mattered to my family. And the recipient's name, the person who was about to receive every single thing I had worked for and inherited and protected, was someone I had never heard of in my life. But here's the thing, that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the date at the bottom of the page. He had signed his portion 3 days ago. 3 days. While I was sitting next to him at dinner. While I was sleeping beside him. While I had absolutely no idea that the life I believed I was living had already been handed over to a stranger. I set the paper down. I walked to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water and stood at the sink for a very long time, staring at nothing. And then I thought of one single thing. One thing that rose up above everything else. Above the shock, above the betrayal, above the grief, that was already starting to move through me like cold water. I thought about the original deed, the one my mother's attorney had filed, the one that was sitting in a county records office right now with a very specific name on it, mine. And I was almost completely certain that Thomas had forgotten about that. Before I get into what happened next, I want to say something real quick. If you have ever trusted someone completely, given them access to your life, your family, your future, and had them use that trust like a weapon against you, this story is going to stay with you. Hit subscribe and stay with me, because what I uncovered over the next 3 months was bigger than I ever expected, and it starts right now. Let me back up about 11 years, because this story only makes sense if you understand what was actually at stake. My mother, Carolyn, started our company in 1998 with $30,000 she had saved working double shifts as a bookkeeper for 15 years. That, and one piece of commercial property she bought at a low price from a retiring family friend who believed in her when most people didn't. The property was in a part of our city that people wrote off back then. An older commercial strip, nothing glamorous, nothing impressive. Most of the investors she showed it to told her she was being sentimental, that it would never be worth anything significant. My mother didn't think it was worthless. She had a feeling about it. The kind of feeling that came from watching a city for decades, from knowing which neighborhoods were quietly being cleaned up, which roads were getting new lanes, which zip codes were about to become desirable. She saw the trajectory before most people could. She converted those spaces. She leased them. She reinvested every dollar of rent income back into maintenance and small improvements. She bought 2 more commercial properties within 5 years. And by the time I graduated college, she had built something real. A regional property management company with a small but steady portfolio, reliable tenants, and a reputation for being the kind of landlord who actually kept her word. She was meticulous about the legal structure from the beginning. She had a business attorney she trusted, and she made sure every important document was airtight. When I joined the business full-time after graduation, she sat me down and walked me through everything. The accounts, the LLC structure, the contracts, the relationships with each tenant. And then she showed me the original deed. She had titled the physical property, the foundation of everything, the first building she had ever bought, solely in my name. Not the company's name, my name. She was old-fashioned about real estate. Companies can be restructured, she always said. Partnerships change, but the land stays. And the land should belong to someone specific, not to a piece of paper. When she passed away 6 years ago after a short illness, I was devastated in ways I still struggle to fully put into words. She was my mother, my mentor, and my closest friend. But she had also spent years making sure I was protected. The ownership structure was clear. My name was attached to the foundation of everything she had built, legally, financially, unmistakably. I met Thomas about a year before she passed. He wasn't flashy. That's the thing I always come back to. He wasn't the kind of man who walked into a room and announced himself. He was measured, patient. He had this quality of making you feel genuinely seen when you talked to him, like you were the most interesting person he had encountered in a long time, and he meant it. We got married 2 years after I lost my mother. He had a background in commercial real estate, property law, lease negotiations, tenant relations, and it felt, at the time, like something that had been sent specifically for me, someone who understood the world I was living in, someone who could grow alongside what my mother had built. He came into the business as an operations manager. Within a year, he was handling all of our major lease negotiations and vendor relationships. Within 2 years, he was essentially running the operational side while I managed the financial and strategic decisions. I told myself we were partners, equal partners, in the business and in the marriage. And for a while, I want to be completely honest here, it was genuinely good. We worked well together. We grew the portfolio by 2 additional properties. We hired a dedicated property manager, a full-time accountant, and an administrative assistant. Things ran smoothly. Our tenants renewed. Our numbers were solid. But there were things I was missing. I see them so clearly now. Small things, one at a time, each one explainable on its own. But together, they told a story I wasn't reading. The first sign came about 8 months before I found that document on his desk. Thomas started staying late at the office, which, by itself, was nothing unusual. We both worked long hours, especially during lease renewal seasons. But the texture of it changed. He started going in on Saturdays without mentioning why. He stopped bringing work home at night, which was actually the opposite of his normal pattern. For years, I could hear him on calls in the evenings, dealing with some contractor issue or tenant question. Suddenly, the evenings were quiet. I asked him about it once, easily, conversationally, not with any suspicion in my voice. He said he was renegotiating the lease agreements on our 2 newer properties. Standard seasonal review. Routine. Nothing worth getting into over dinner. I nodded. I believed him. The second sign happened about 2 months later. Roger, our accountant, a careful and quiet man who had worked with my mother for years, called me directly one afternoon. He almost always routed business questions through Thomas for operational matters, so the fact that he was reaching out to me felt slightly off from the moment I saw his name on my phone. I just wanted to confirm, he said slowly, that you're aware of the changes being proposed to the operating account structure. I was not aware of any changes. I told him so. There was a pause that lasted just a second too long, and then Roger said, "Thomas told me you two had already discussed it. I probably just need to loop back with him on the specifics." And then he ended the call. Quickly, more quickly than the conversation warranted. When I brought it up to Thomas that evening, he handled it perfectly. He was relaxed and unbothered. He said Roger had gotten ahead of himself on a conversation that was still preliminary, that nothing was finalized, nothing was decided, that he'd clean it up. And he did clean it up, at least on the surface. Roger sent me a follow-up email a few days later saying it had been a miscommunication and that everything remained as it was. I almost let the whole thing go. But something kept pulling at me. Roger had been with my mother during the years when she was fighting hard to keep the business stable after the financial crisis. He had seen real pressure and never flinched. He was not a man who made miscommunication calls and then reversed course in 3 days. That wasn't how he operated. I didn't say anything more about it. I filed it away, and I watched. The moment things started cracking open happened on a Thursday afternoon when I went to Thomas's office to find a contract template we kept in his desktop filing system. He was out showing a property to a prospective tenant. I wasn't going through his things. I went in there with one specific purpose and no intention beyond it. But when I opened the lateral filing cabinet to pull our standard folder, I saw a name on a tab that I didn't recognize. We worked with a lot of vendors, contractors, and consultants, so unfamiliar names weren't immediately alarming. But this wasn't a company name. It was a person's name, written in that specific shorthand Thomas used when something was more personal than professional. Danielle Marsh. I opened the folder. There wasn't a lot inside. A few printed email chains. A business proposal printed on our company letterhead, which caught my attention immediately because I personally approved everything that went out on our letterhead, and a handwritten sheet of notes in Thomas's writing that I couldn't fully decipher. The proposal described something it called a management restructuring. It outlined a process for transitioning day-to-day operational control of the business to an outside property management professional. It named that professional Danielle Marsh. The proposal was dated 4 months ago. I stood in his office holding that piece of paper and tried to understand what I was reading. A management restructuring? He and I hadn't discussed anything remotely like this. I handled strategy and finance. He handled operations. We made major decisions together. That was how we had always done it. This document described a process that didn't include me at all. I photographed every page with my phone. I put the folder back exactly as I had found it. I grabbed the template I had originally come for and walked back to my office. I didn't say a word to Thomas that evening, or the day after. I needed to understand what I was looking at before I reacted to anything, because I knew instinctively that if I came at this with emotion before I had information, I would lose whatever advantage I didn't yet realize I had. That decision to wait was probably the best one I made throughout this entire experience. I reached out to Patricia, our company attorney, a woman who had worked with my mother for over a decade, under the guise of reviewing some general operational questions. I kept it vague at first. I asked about what a management restructuring typically looked like from a legal standpoint, what consent would be required, what rights a primary owner had if a partner proposed structural changes without full disclosure. She answered professionally, and then she asked me something I wasn't prepared for. Has anyone made any recent requests to review the original deed and estate transfer records? I went very still. She told me that approximately 3 weeks earlier, a request for copies of the deed transfer documentation from my mother's estate had been submitted to her office. The request had come through Thomas's name and used our company letterhead. She had forwarded the documents without question because it appeared to be routine business record management. She said, "I assumed you had authorized the request." I had not authorized it. I kept my voice level. I thanked her. I told her I'd follow up on a few things and we'd talk soon. Thomas had requested copies of the estate records, the documents that established exactly whose name appeared on the property deed and exactly how the ownership had been transferred after my mother's passing. He had been looking into the legal foundation of what we owned and how it was titled. He was looking for something specific. I sat with that for 3 full days before I moved again. I needed to think clearly. I needed to be methodical, because the moment Thomas sensed that I was aware of any of this, everything would accelerate in his favor. He was better positioned to move quickly than I was. He had already been planning this for months. He had a head start. But he had also made one critical assumption that I wasn't sure he had verified properly. I hired a forensic accountant on Patricia's recommendation. His name was David. He was precise, unhurried, and had a way of explaining financial irregularities the way a doctor explains an X-ray, pointing to things that look almost normal but aren't quite right if you know what you're looking for. I gave him 3 years of business financial records. I told him I needed a full picture of our operating structure. He came back to me in 2 weeks. The first thing he found, 2 consulting fee payments, both for identical amounts, both authorized solely by Thomas, both made to an entity called DM Property Solutions. DM. Danielle Marsh. The second thing, those payments were not one-time fees. They had started as a single transaction and grown into a monthly arrangement over the course of 18 months. The cumulative total had crossed $60,000. That level of expenditure, from our operating accounts to an outside individual, should have required joint authorization and disclosure under our operating agreement. It had never come to me, not once. The third thing David found was what made my hands go cold. Buried inside a cloud storage account linked to our business email, inside a folder Thomas had named Archive 2019, old enough that no one would think to open it, was a draft operating agreement. Not signed, but detailed, specific, clearly not preliminary. The draft restructured the business entirely. It removed my operational designation. It established Danielle Marsh as the sole operating manager with a defined path to full ownership. And buried in the language on page 9 was a clause referring to the buyout of what it described as the secondary ownership interest. Secondary. In my own mother's company. Built on property my mother had placed in my name specifically so that it could never be taken. He had written me into a document that described me as secondary, something to be bought out and stepped over. David laid all of this out across a table in a quiet and professional way. He didn't add commentary, he just pointed to each piece and explained what it meant in plain language. When he was finished, I asked him one thing. Is any of what he's built actually legal? He measured his words carefully. Some elements could potentially create complications, depending on how aggressively someone pursued them. But the deed is the keystone of everything. If your name is on the original property deed as the sole primary title holder, any agreement that attempts to transfer, restructure, or supersede the business without a simultaneous transfer of that property is legally incomplete. It cannot be executed without your signature. You cannot be removed from something you own the ground beneath. There it was, clear and simple. My name was on the deed, not as a secondary interest, not as a co-holder, as the owner. And Thomas had either never fully verified that, or had assumed he could engineer his way around it, or, and this was the possibility that sat with me longest, he had simply believed I wasn't paying close enough attention to stop him. He had underestimated me, quietly and completely. I went home that night. I made dinner. I asked Thomas how his day had been. He said fine. He asked about mine. I said fine. We watched television for an hour. We went to bed. I lay in the dark listening to him breathe, and I did not sleep for a long time. I was thinking about all of it, not just the financial mechanics, but the architecture of what he had built, the patient, careful way he had made himself essential to everything operational, the way he had gradually shifted my role towards strategy and away from the day-to-day, which had felt considerate at the time. The way he had changed our internal email routing system for efficiency 6 months ago so that legal and vendor correspondence came to his inbox first. He had been building something inside our marriage, inside our business, inside the life my mother had given me. He had been building it for at least 2 years, maybe longer. And the part that I kept returning to, the part that I still find difficult to sit with, is that I had given him the keys to do it. Not because I was naive, but because I had trusted him, because I believed that the person sleeping beside me was who he said he was. I made a decision that night. I was not going to confront him until I was completely prepared, not until every piece was in place, every document was filed, every professional who needed to know already knew. Because if I moved too early, he could react. He could accelerate the transfer, drain accounts, create legal entanglements that would take years to untangle. He had been at this for months. I needed to close the distance between his position and mine before he knew I was moving at all. I needed to run faster than he could hear my footsteps. Over the following 6 weeks, I worked almost entirely in the windows of time when Thomas was out of the house. Patricia and I met 3 times in her office. She pulled every founding document, the original incorporation papers, my mother's estate transfer filings, the deed itself, the LLC operating agreement from the year Thomas joined the business. She reviewed everything. Then she sat across from me and delivered something that felt, genuinely, like the first full breath I had taken in months. "You are the sole title holder on the physical property," she said. "The deed has never been altered or amended. Thomas holds an operational partner designation within the business entity, but the entity itself does not own the property. The business operates on your property. It's always operated on your property. Any transfer of the business interest is legally incomplete without a corresponding transfer of the real property, and that transfer requires your signature, your acknowledgement, your full and documented consent. She looked at me directly. He cannot transfer what he doesn't own. He can draft documents until the end of the year. None of them will hold without you. Then she added something else. She told me that forwarding the estate records to Thomas 3 weeks earlier without confirming with me first was a mistake she took responsibility for. She said it plainly, and she apologized without any defensiveness. I told her I appreciated that more than she probably knew. We then turned to the question of who Danielle Marsh actually was, because up until that point I had a name, a company name, and a trail of payments. What I didn't have was context. David found her. She was a licensed property manager. She was experienced and professionally credentialed, and she had a prior working relationship with Thomas, from a commercial real estate firm where they had both been employed several years before I met him, before he came into my family's business. Before me. He had known her for years before he met me. He had entered my business, built himself into the center of its operations, maintained a connection to someone he had history with, and at some point had begun planning a path that ended with her holding what my mother had built. I sat in Patricia's car in a parking lot after we pieced that together, and I looked out the window for a long time without saying anything. And then I said, "Okay, tell me what we do next." Patricia's strategy was precise. She called it getting ahead of the transaction. Thomas was building toward a final moment, a point where the pieces he had quietly arranged would be formalized into something legally enforceable. We didn't know exactly what form that final step would take, but we knew it was coming, and we needed to be positioned before he took it. Step 1. Patricia filed a formal notice of ownership clarification with the county records office, refreshing and confirming the existing deed documentation. We weren't changing anything, just creating a dated, current, official record that the property's title had been reviewed and confirmed in my name within the last 30 days. This would be the first thing any title search turned up. Step 2. Patricia sent a formal notice to our business bank establishing that any structural changes to the company accounts required dual authorization, both signatures, both parties, no exceptions. This wasn't adversarial or unusual. Many cooperated businesses had dual authorization requirements, but it quietly closed a door that had apparently been open without my realizing it. Step 3. David prepared a comprehensive financial audit report. Organized, sourced, dated. Every irregularity. Every unauthorized payment. Everything that showed a pattern over time, not for confrontation yet, for evidence. Step 4, the hardest one. I had to continue being completely normal. Every morning I made coffee and talked about weather and tenant news and what we should do for the weekend. Every evening I sat across the dinner table from this man and kept my face and voice completely level. I asked about his day. I laughed at things. I planned a dinner out with friends and went and behaved like a person whose life was intact. I don't know how I did it, honestly. I think knowing that an ending was coming, and knowing that I was steering it, was the only thing that made it possible. There was one evening where I almost broke. Thomas was talking about a lease renewal coming up on one of our newer properties. Relaxed, conversational. And in the middle of it, he said something so casually that it almost went by me. He said, "You know, once things settle down a bit this fall, I've been thinking, maybe it's time for you to take a real step back. You've been pushing hard for years. You deserve some time to breathe." I looked at him across the table. He was smiling that easy, unworried smile that had once made me feel safe in any situation. I smiled back. I said that sounded like something worth thinking about. But what I heard was, "I'm almost finished. I need you out of the way for the last step." I excused myself to get more water. I stood at the kitchen sink for 30 seconds and looked out at the backyard and just breathed. When I came back to the table, I was smiling again. But I knew we were close. We were very close. Thomas told me 3 days later that he needed to take a quick overnight trip, a property in another city that a contact had flagged, something worth looking at in person. He'd be gone 2 nights, back Sunday. I said have a good trip. I waved from the porch. On Friday afternoon, Patricia called me. She had received a filing alert, triggered automatically by the county records notice we had placed. notifying her that a transfer of business interest document had been officially submitted 2 days prior. The document described the transfer of what it called the full operational and economic interest in our business. The recipient was Danielle Marsh. He had moved, while I was home, while he was supposedly looking at property in another city. Patricia's voice was completely calm. She said, "He filed." I took a breath. "Are we ready?" She said, "We've been ready for 2 weeks." Here's what happened in the next 48 hours, and I want to explain it clearly, because the legal specifics are the core of the entire story. The document Thomas had filed was structured around our business entity, the LLC that operated the property management company. It described a transfer of all operational rights and economic interests to Danielle Marsh in exchange for a structured future payment. On its face, it resembled a standard business sale. What it could not address, what it was structurally incapable of addressing, was the physical property. Because the property the business operated on was deeded solely to me. Without a simultaneous, legally valid transfer of that property, the business entity had no location, no asset foundation, no right to operate on the ground it had always operated on. You cannot sell a company and forget to include the building it's built on. Patricia filed an immediate legal challenge on 3 grounds. The document misrepresented the full asset structure of the business. It had been executed without the primary owner's knowledge or consent, and it was legally incomplete, without a corresponding property transfer that had never been initiated and could not be initiated without my signature. She also formally documented the $60,000 pattern of unauthorized consulting payments to Danielle Marsh through DM Property Solutions as a potential breach of fiduciary duty within the partnership. Thomas came home Sunday night. I was sitting in the living room, just sitting. The television was off, the house was quiet. He came in the front door with his overnight bag, and when he saw me sitting there in the stillness, something moved across his face, something small. The smallest possible flicker, gone in less than a second, and replaced immediately with that familiar, practiced calm. "Hey," he said, "how was your weekend?" "Quiet," I said. "Patricia called." He set his bag down slowly. "She filed a legal challenge to the transfer on Friday," I said. "The bank also received the dual authorization requirement last week, so the account restructuring you were working toward is on hold indefinitely." He was very quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. And then he said something I will remember for the rest of my life. He did not ask what I was talking about. He did not say there had been a misunderstanding. He did not look confused or hurt or surprised. He looked at me and said, "You can't stop this." I held that for 1 second. "Thomas," I said, "my name is on the deed, not yours, mine. It has been in my name since my mother put it there, and it has never changed. You have spent 2 years designing an exit strategy, and you built the entire thing on top of property that you cannot legally transfer without my signature." He started to say something. "You paid Danielle Marsh over $60,000 from our operating accounts without my authorization or knowledge," I said. "You drafted an operating agreement that removed my role entirely without ever bringing it to me. You attempted to transfer a business that cannot be legally transferred without my participation, and you did all of it while I was making dinner and asking you about your day." I paused. "But here's the thing about my mother," I said. "She knew about people who underestimate quiet women. She planned for it. She put my name on that deed for exactly this moment." He looked at me for a long time. The calm was still there on the surface, but underneath it, I could see the exact moment he understood that it was over. And then he left. I want to stop right here for a second, because I know some of you are sitting with a lot of feelings right now. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in that room? Would you have stayed calm? Would you have said more? Would you have said less? Because honestly, in the days leading up to that moment, I ran through it 100 different ways, and I'd genuinely love to know what you think. If this story is landing for you, please subscribe, because it doesn't end here, and the next part is the part that actually changed my life. Thomas did not stay that night. He left. And when I heard his car leave the driveway and the sound of it fading out of earshot, something I had been carrying for months, this tight, compressed thing in the center of my chest, loosened its grip for the first time. I want to be honest about what came after, because I think people expect a certain kind of ending to a story like this: clean, immediate, satisfying in a tidy way. That's not how real justice works. What followed was months of legal proceedings, attorney calls, document filings, depositions, and financial negotiations. There were days that were exhausting in ways I couldn't have predicted. There were moments where I questioned myself, not about what I knew, but about whether I had the endurance to see it all the way through. The legal challenge to the transfer succeeded. The business interest transfer Thomas had filed was voided by the court. It had never been legally sound. The moment any competent property attorney examined the ownership structure, the whole thing unraveled. You cannot transfer a business built on someone else's property without their knowledge and call it a complete transaction. The court agreed with Patricia's challenge without significant hesitation. Danielle Marsh's situation was more complicated. From what I later understood through the legal process, she had genuinely believed Thomas could deliver what he had promised her. She had paid him money, personal funds, outside of the consulting arrangement, in exchange for what she believed was a legitimate path to business ownership. Whether she knew the full extent of how he had been engineering this from inside our marriage, I honestly cannot say. What I know is that she received formal legal notification that the arrangement was void and unenforceable. Whatever she had been promised, it was gone. The $60,000 in unauthorized consulting payments became the central financial issue in our divorce proceedings. Patricia connected me with a family law attorney named James, who had spent his career handling exactly this kind of case: business assets in a marriage where one partner had been working systematically against the other. He had seen versions of this before. He said so, more than once, and it was oddly steadying to hear. Thomas's attorneys argued that his 7 years of operational contribution to the business's growth created an equitable interest that the court should recognize. That was not an unreasonable argument, and James told me up front to expect it. Thomas had contributed real work. The business had genuinely grown during the years he was involved. But David's forensic audit was thorough. Every unauthorized payment was documented. The operating agreement draft was in evidence. The pattern of behavior, the methodical, multi-year effort to position himself and Danielle Marsh at the expense of the business's rightful owner, was laid out for the court to examine. In the end, the court awarded me the business and the property intact. Thomas received a settlement that reflected his legitimate years of contribution, which was fair, and which James had prepared me for. It was considerably less than what Thomas had anticipated receiving through the path he had chosen. And it was far less than what he would have received if he had simply come to me honestly and said, "I want to restructure things. I want to leave. Let's figure out what's fair." Instead, he had spent 2 years orchestrating something that required my ignorance to succeed, and my ignorance had run out. Roger retired at the end of that year. Before he cleaned out his desk, he came by my office and sat down. He told me he had noticed things that made him uncomfortable for longer than he had admitted to himself, and that he hadn't found a way to bring them to me directly. He said it clearly and without making excuses. I thanked him. I told him I believed him, and I told him that the phone call he had made, the one I had almost talked myself out of taking seriously, had started everything. That phone call had cracked open the right door at exactly the right time. He probably didn't know how much weight that moment carried. Now he did. Patricia and I still work together. She sent me a handwritten note about 6 months after the proceedings concluded. It said, simply, "Your mother would be proud." I read it twice, and then I cried for about 20 minutes. And then I made coffee and went back to work. It's been almost 2 years now. The business is still standing. Still growing, actually. I hired a new operations manager, a woman who came highly recommended, who has been exactly who she appeared to be in every conversation we've had. I work with David quarterly. I review every account movement myself. Patricia confirms everything with me directly, before she acts on anyone's behalf. The structures are tighter now, the oversight is better, and I no longer confuse trust with the absence of attention. Losing a marriage is painful even when the marriage was something it shouldn't have been. I want to say that honestly, because I think sometimes people expect you to feel only relief when something this broken finally ends. But it's more complicated than that. Thomas was someone I had built a life with, someone I had sat beside at my mother's funeral, someone who knew things about me that took years to share. Losing that, even a version of it that was partly illusion, carries its own grief. There are still moments, ordinary moments. A song on the radio, or a restaurant we used to go to, or a quiet Sunday morning that has a shape I remember from before, and something goes hollow for just a second. I don't fight those moments anymore. I just let them pass through. But here's what I know now that I didn't know 2 years ago. I am more myself than I have been in years. Maybe ever. There is something that happens to you when you are forced to see a situation with absolute clarity, when you can't look away, when the document is right there in front of you, and you have to choose who you're going to be in response to it. I chose to be my mother's daughter. She spent decades building something real because she understood that if you plant yourself in solid ground, if you hold on to what actually belongs to you, the storms that come have a harder time taking you down completely. She didn't succeed because things were easy. She succeeded because she was thorough. Careful, patient. She believed in putting important things in writing, in having the right people in the right places, in protecting herself quietly before she ever needed to protect herself loudly. She put my name on that deed because she knew that the foundation matters. That no matter what else shifts or changes or disappoints you, you need something solid beneath you that belongs to you. She called it the land. She said, it stays. She was right. It stayed. And so did I. Thank you. Genuinely. If you watched this all the way to the end, it means something to me that I don't take lightly. These stories aren't easy to tell, and the fact that you stayed, that you cared enough to follow the whole thing through, is the reason I keep sharing them. If something in this story hit close to home, I'd love for you to leave a comment. Tell me what part stayed with you. Tell me what you would have done differently. Tell me your own story, even just a piece of it, because this community has shown me over and over again that you don't go through hard things alone when you're willing to talk about them honestly. If you're new here, please subscribe. Every story I share is about the moment someone decided not to give up, and what it looked like when they didn't. I think you'll find a few more worth your time. I'll see you in the next one.